Today we're going to talk about identity, and we're going to hear a number of voices that many of you probably have never heard before as we discuss the role of the black woman as a woman, but also as a classical voice, a voice in classical music. So we'd like to start with a piece not by a woman and not to poetry by a woman, but to a work called Troubled Woman by Hale Smith. First slide, please. This is the African-American woman of legend, the troubled woman, and this text is highlighted by the dissonance, by the pain, by what we conceive of as the painful intervals that we're not used to hearing. And so this is what we're starting from, but what we're going to explore is everything else that you've never heard of. Most people think of the African-American musical experience in terms of jazz. Next slide, please. However, within classical music, we have had very, very important people, particularly singers, practicing the art. The first one is the Black Swan, Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield. And she sort of paved the way long before Marian Anderson as the internationally recognized African-American woman, soprano, singer, who performed before royalty, who was recognized for her artistry within the classical repertoire. The next one?
Oh, can we go back?
Sure, yeah.
Something I really want to point out about Miss Greenfield is that, is that on? Hello? Okay. This is one of the most amazing stories I've ever really heard. She grew up in slavery, was a slave, and her mistress decided to move up north and became a Quaker and freed her from slavery and patronized her for the rest of her life. So this is a hugely important story that we should all know and acknowledge. So
That we don't know.
that we don't know and that we should acknowledge. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, shall we go to the next one, please? Adelina Patti was one of the great opera singers of previous generations. And so this Cicieretta Jones was named for Adelina Patti because, once again, of her international reputation and her artistry. Have you got a story?
Yes. Cicieretta is probably another really important singer. At Carnegie Hall, they have all of these medals that she's wearing right now. And I live in New York now, and and I work down the street from where all of these medals are. And so every day I'm reminded that she existed and that she is so important. And her story is actually really, really sad. She lived on the East Coast as well, and there's a marker where she lived. She traveled everywhere with her own group, with other groups, as much as she could under segregation and, you know, all of that. And she ended up having to take care of her mother and died in poverty. So
The other issue about her is that when she came back from her tours in the United States, she could not find the same performing opportunities that she could find in Europe. And this sort of coincided with the idea that she had to come back and take care of her mother. And she did try and found a troupe, but it was not in classical music. It was more in the popular idiom, because that is what she was pigeonholed as, rather than as a classical artist. And she did die in poverty. This is not a good story with a happy ending. But you can see what an amazing, I mean, with the honors, you can see the evidence of her recognition in Carnegie Hall.
And that also points out the same thing with Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield. They were known as the black versions of the white artists. They weren't just their own artists. So that's another thing, important thing.
Next slide, please. One of the names that is possibly known to classical musicians around the world is that of William Grant Still. And as you can see, he was the first to do a lot of things. But once again, while we know him, we classical musicians know him for what he is, for the artist he is still associated with one other genre that is very much associated with the black experience, and that is that of the spiritual. And the spiritual is very, very important because even within the classical genres, you will find it sometimes as one of the elements that keeps creeping in. It is part of the experience that is core to the experience. So we'd like to start out with a spiritual arrangement by William Grant Still.
Talk about
we'd like to introduce Florence Price, 1887-1953. She is one of the firsts. As you can see, she's recognized as a symphonic composer, and she was educated at New England Conservatory of Music. And of course, she also had roots in the spiritual. We'd like to perform 2 art songs by her. The art song is a genre that exists within poetry as the start. It starts with a poem, and the composer takes the poem and complements the idea. And before we perform these songs, we'd like Dr. Carter to talk about poetry and the poetry that Florence Price might have experienced.
Certainly. Testing. Test. 1, 2, 3, okay. I think it's important as we begin to look at issues of identity that we begin to understand that the 1920s ushered in an entire new realm of identification for African Americans, opportunities for African Americans that had never existed before. That backdrop set the stage for poets, for artists, for musicians, for writers to collaborate in ways that had never before been available to them. When you think about what was going on during that time period, we were just exiting World War I. The troops that fought on World War I that were African Americans and fought under the French flag had ushered in a victorious era for African Americans at that time, and a sense of pride that was unmatched within the community. This jazz age, as it was coined back then, or as it's coined now, was one that sort of served as the umbrella time period for the thing that we now refer to as the Harlem Renaissance. Of course, back then it was not known as such. During the 1920s, the early 1920s, there was an opportunity that came about that really made possible these poets and these writers to make their place in African American culture and in American culture. And it all started with an event that occurred in 1924, 1925. And it was called the Civic Club Banquet. Now, the Civic Club Banquet was an idea that was thought up by the head of the Urban League at that time, Charles S. Johnson, and Howard University scholar by the name of Alain Locke. And they thought that it would be a fantastic idea to get writers of color together with white publishers that were finding new economic opportunities within these writers of color to produce these works of art that would be then made available to the American public, because of this thing that we were experiencing that began in France, actually, called negrophilia, this love of blackness. And it was because of this love of blackness that this event was really such a success. The Civic Club Banquet spawned a journal, which actually published articles within a journal called the Survey Graphic. And the Survey Graphic was edited by Paul Kellogg. And Paul Kellogg approached Alain Locke and said, look, these writers and these artists, these poets that you have in this edition of my magazine are amazing. Why don't you turn this into an anthology that would then be sort of the hallmark of what these new Negroes are capable of? And that's how the term the New Negro Movement really became entrenched in African American culture during that time period. Now, unfortunately, during that time, this was a relatively male-centric movement. And that was really because of the misogynistic attitudes of Alain Locke and some of the other males that were sort of the leaders of this particular movement. But within that movement, there were some amazing women writers, women poets, women artists, female musicians that were just making an identification for themselves and for the African American community that had never before been heard. Their voices were coming out loud and clear in ways that you can never possibly imagine. We're hearing some of them this morning, and you will hear some of them through the poetry that my students will be reading just a little bit later on. So when you think about this movement and think about the Harlem Renaissance, it was such an exciting time period. There was so much going on in American culture, from the second women's rights movement, which was going on at this time, from Prohibition, from the rise of the mob and gangsters, to the Jazz Age, and to things happening in Europe and in America, and the reflexive actions that were going on between the two countries. It was absolutely amazing during this time, if you were of a certain socioeconomic class and if your voice was loud enough. So if we listen to some of the words that we're hearing today, if we listen to the words of the poets that are going to be singing here in just a few moments, I think that will paint just another picture of what the excitement of this particular time period.
the Dean of Black Women Composers. And she went eventually to the eminent school, the Juilliard School, on scholarship. and she was also a Pulitzer Prize nominee. She received honorary doctorates, and she is a major figure in this first generation of art song composers. Music that complements great poetry. Now this piece that we're about to perform is sort of unusual because the lyric for True Love is written to a lyric by Florence Hines Willette, who was known as a religious poet who wrote under the aegis of the Catholic Church in Minnesota. There exists a prize in her name, and she was white. And so all of a sudden we start finding this whole business of the woman's voice being that of a woman's voice, as opposed to the African American woman's voice. As you start to see a sort of universality emerging within the voices of these composers. We had a discussion about what this text meant to you.
Well, I love this text and this piece in general because
it highlights an emotion that's not generally associated with Black women in the larger cultural narrative, a woman in love. Simply that. We hardly ever see this. So this piece just sort of does it for me.
If you look at the picture of Margaret Bonds, you might see that this is a poster in which she's performing as a solo pianist at Town Hall in New York. This is a major performance venue. And Margaret Bonds was multi-talented. As you can see that she ended up from Northwestern at the Juilliard School. She was a soloist with one of America's major orchestras, and she collaborated with Langston Hughes. And at the very, very end, the great Nadia Boulanger, who was the European teacher to which many American composers went to, including Copland, Leonard Bernstein, everyone went to see Nadia in Paris for lessons. Boulanger said, this woman does not need any more lessons, when she wanted to go study. And what she had shown to Boulanger was her setting of The Negro Speaks of Rivers, which is part of her collaboration with Langston Hughes and with other poets of the Harlem Renaissance. So this was a major voice. I find her interesting just as a musician, not only because of her art songs and her other works, but because of her spiritual arrangements. The arrangement of the spiritual can tell a lot about the person behind it, as well as highlighting the emotion in the spiritual. As you listen to this setting of Lord, I Just Can't Keep From Crying, it will sound a little bit different. And we'll tell you why, or you'll probably know why, but we'll probably analyze it just a little bit later. Classical musician with no background in spiritual whatsoever, what do I hear in this? I hear a cross between the classical song and the spiritual. We have the spiritual, but the giveaway to me is the ending to each verse. It changes. The first time, it gets longer. And listen to the harmony. She does what Schubert does so often. Major, And the very last time, we start in major, but see where she goes. It's different. And in an art song, a lot of times the piano tells you whether it's going to be a happy ending or not. And so you can see that within this one setting, which is strophic, it's got verses, and the music underneath all the verses is the same. These little endings are in the same spirit of the classical musicians of centuries before, tells you about the emotional wavering that the speaker is talking about, and tells you what the ending is all about. Very, very ingenious setting.
And what I love about this ending too is that most spirituals do end on that really sad note. That's just it. But what's great about this one is that there's hope there. There's something else besides that.
And in contrast, Jackson King. I love her smile. She actually taught at the school that I attended in Chicago, the University of Chicago Lab Schools, which stressed the whole idea of learning by doing. She taught there before I got there, I might add. But the smile to me epitomizes what we are going to hear in this art song that she has created. It is, to me, first of all, the lyric is incredibly fun. But the other thing that you find in it is a duality. If you listen to the beginning, you will hear classical composition, but you will hear it change, and then change back. This is, this is Paul Laurence Dunbar.
Actually, testing? Okay. Actually, I just wanted to go right back to Langston Hughes just for a moment, because as we all know, he was one of the most popular writers, poets of that particular time period. His song that we just, or his poem that we just heard sung, I Too, was of course one of the greats that looked at Negro identity during this particular time. One of the poems that was mentioned earlier, Negro Speaks of Rivers, his first published piece, was one that was identified actually by Jessie Fawcett, who was the literary editor of The Crisis, working under W.E.B. Du Bois. And when she recognized the power of that poem, I Too, I think it was extremely important that Du Bois published that under The Crisis bannister and looked at how Langston Hughes really then set the stage for many of his other pieces to come. I think in contrast to Langston Hughes was a very important voice of Georgia Douglas Johnson. And if you don't mind, I'd like to have one of my students read Georgia Douglas Johnson's piece. And I think you'll hear a very interesting contrast, not only to that which we've just heard sung, but also that which we are going to hear as we get more into Negro and female identity.
Good morning, everyone. So this is just a little bit about Georgia Douglas Johnson. Born Georgia Blanche Douglas in Atlanta, she attended Oberlin Conservatory of Music after her graduation from Atlanta University. In 1903, she married Henry Lincoln Johnson, a prominent Republican attorney whose parents were ex-slaves. In 1912, President Taft appointed Henry Johnson recorder of the Deans for Washington, D.C. After Henry Johnson's death, Taft appointed Georgia Douglas Johnson a position as a commissioner for the Department of Labor. As a writer of several genres, Johnson was prolific. So now I'm going to do her poem, Motherhood. Don't knock on my door, little child. I cannot let you in. You know not what the world this is of cruelty and sin. Wait in the still eternity until I come to you. This world is cruel, cruel, child. I cannot let you through. Don't knock at my heart, little one. I cannot bear the pain of turning deaf ears to your call, time and time again. You do not know of these monster men inhabiting the earth. Be still, my precious child. I cannot give you birth. Thank you.
About a lot of the composers, their personal lives. Generally, we don't acknowledge that they were going through a lot of the same work-life balances that we're going through currently with, you know, how do you raise children and how do you work? For Black women, a lot of the times you didn't really have a choice to have a balance, but a lot of the composers did find themselves struggling with the choice to compose and to also raise their children because they did have families and were married.
I mean, I think it probably speaks for itself. Actually, Paul Laurence Dunbar.
Paul Laurence Dunbar, he was, of course, one of the great early African-American poets just before the turn of the century. Interestingly enough, Paul Laurence Dunbar was one of the very few African-American poets who could actually earn his keep through his poetry. However, he was a bit controversial. Interestingly enough, Paul Laurence Dunbar was mostly known for his dialect poetry. Those poems that were mostly about plantation life. His mother used to tell him all sorts of stories about life on the plantation, and just like many mothers, she wanted to shield him from some of the horrors of plantation life and what it was really like. So Paul grew up thinking more different thoughts about the plantation as opposed to maybe some of the more realistic aspects of it. And his plantation poetry or his dialect poetry was that which became not only very well known, but also, of course, that which was most popular. But he was torn, just like many artists are today, that have to write or perform that which they don't necessarily like very much, but that which pays the bills. Unfortunately, Paul was stuck in that particular rut, so to speak, whereby he had to publish these dialect poems because that's what people were buying, but his other standard verse, no one was buying that, and he wasn't necessarily known as an American poet. He was known as a Black American dialect poet, and he hated that particular title. So when you think about Paul Laurence Dunbar, we have to think of him as a duality. During the Harlem Renaissance, actually, he was maligned for his depiction of plantation life and his painting of the happy-go-lucky Negro and the always dancing and singing mammy on the plantation. And of course, that was only a small part of his poetic output, interestingly enough. So when we think about Paul, I think we have to also, we can definitely connect that to some of our more contemporary artists who may be stuck in that particular same rut.
Change? Okay, especially the very end is very, very classical. When she's talking about her neighbors, who knows what they are doing.
All right, we have another piece by another one of my students who's going to read a piece called
It's called The Heart of a Woman.
Come on up. The Heart of a Woman.
Sorry, that was you. Hello, everyone. Okay, here's the poem. The Heart of a Woman. The heart of a woman goes forth with the dawn, as a lone bird's soft winging so restlessly on. Afar o'er's life, turrets and vales does it roam. In the wake of those echoes, the heart calls home. The heart of a woman falls back with the night and enters some alien cage in its plight and tries to forget it has dreamed of the stars while it breaks, breaks, breaks on the sheltering bars. Thank you.
Another one by Georgia Douglas Johnson, by the way.
Hello, it's called Your World. Your world is as big as you make it. I know, for I used to abide in the narrowest nest in a corner, my wings pressing close to my side. But I sighted the distant horizon where the skyline encircled the sea, and I throbbed with a burning desire to travel this immensity. I battered the curtains around me and cradled my wings on the breeze, then soared to the uttermost reaches with rapture, with power, with ease. Thank you.
The next two composers are going to be using their own words. The first, Jacqueline B. Hairston, we're going to start with a spiritual setting. She was born in 1938, although it's very hard to find out when she was born. I think she's being a beautiful woman at this particular point. But we'd like to start with Guide My Feet and then follow it with one of the songs from her song cycle called Unconsciousness Streams. And this is a very unusual song cycle in that there are 3 poets represented. But they are not poets necessarily. One of them is not thought of as a poet. She, of course, has written the words to the song we're about to perform, but the poet which joins her in the cycle is none other than Ludwig van Beethoven, who we do not think of as a poet. The next and last art song that we're going to perform is by Mabel Bailey, who was born in 1939. And she was a school teacher in the Denver public school system, and she wrote her own words. So we'd like to start with Guide My Feet.
Guide my
her. She's sort of hard to find. But I think her experience in the schools is reflected in the poetry which she constructed, which she wrote for A Child's World.
Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. 7 days, guess what I think? Monday, lemon, Tuesday, chocolate, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, ice cream. 7 days, but one I hate is Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. 7 days, but one I hate is Monday. Monday.
So what have we heard today? We've heard a whole bunch of voices that, with one exception, they were all new to me. And I'd like to thank Charmaine for doing all this research. We've heard voices of female poets. Thank you, ladies, for doing the reading. And we've heard about where they came from to a certain extent. What have you heard today?
I've heard a lot of things. I've heard the contrast between the classical music, the poetry that was read, set within a time period that was sometimes relatively hostile to African Americans, particularly African American women. And I've also heard these voices trying to make their place, set an identity that perhaps they were screaming to be heard and wanted to be heard amongst all of the noise that was out there during that particular time period.
You?
For me, it's important. These women are important mostly because when I was growing up, classical music was not something that was associated with black people, for one. So my love of classical music came naturally to me. I don't know exactly where it came from, but the fact that these women exist and have existed since they were able to participate really informs how I participate in classical music.
Are there any questions?
I know you have questions, burning, desiring questions.
Okay. We'd like to end with Margaret Bonds.
You can tell the world about this. You can tell the nation about that. Tell them what Jesus has done. Tell them that the Comforter has come, and He brought joy, joy, joy to my soul. He took my